Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome to Westy Women, the series exploring the lives of West Wallsend's pioneering women. Today, Benita Parker from the West Wallsend District Heritage Group takes on the persona of Violet Harriet Taylor, better known as Vi. Born in West Wallsend in 1906, Vi's life changed forever when she fell in love with returned World War I soldier Joe Taylor. Together, they forged an extraordinary life on Mount Sugarloaf, turning rugged bushland into a home, cattle property and popular tourist destination. This is a story of determination, adventure and the woman Joe called his mountain maid.
My name is Violet, but everyone just calls me Vi. Some people have an ordinary life into which some extraordinary event enters. This is my life. I was born in West Wallsend in 1906, grew up in West Wallsend with my parents and 4 siblings, and then a man named Joe entered my life. I'd like to give you a little more detail about my early years because in so many ways it influenced my adult life. Dad was a bit of a rough diamond. He was born in nearby Minmi to William Henry Williams, Bill Williams to his friends and acquaintances, and his wife Harriet in 1869. Grandpa was a really well-respected butcher in the town of Minmi, and they had 6 sons and 1 daughter. Dad was the 3rd born, and for some reason was given the name of John Gover Williams. Apparently the word Gover is derived from the Welsh language, specifically from the word grr, which translates to warrior or battle. I'm not sure whether we had any Welsh ancestry, but sometimes it really suited my dad. When Dad was about 16, his father had a horrible accident and the doctors had to amputate his leg. In those days, they didn't have the facilities they do today, and unfortunately he died a few days after surgery in 1886. Grandma Harriet died some years later, so I never got to know them, as they had both died many years before I was born. It also meant that their family of 6 boys and 1 girl had no parental guidance after they finished school. I think this may have affected my dad more than some of his brothers. However, they did continue to work their father's butcher shop. Dad helped his brothers to work as butchers, but there were often tensions between them as to who did what and who made all the decisions about the business. When he started courting Mum, who was a local Minmi girl named Emma Strang, in the early 1890s, when he was in his early 20s, he decided to try and open his own butcher's shop in the new village at West Wallsend. They got married in 1895, and their first child, Gladys, was born in the same year. The butchering business was hard work, and in 1906, the year I was born, he sold the business and became a publican, taking over as licensee of the Tattersalls Hotel in Carrington Street, West Wallsend. I remember my oldest sister Gladys getting letters in 1916 during World War I from her boyfriend, Gordon McGecky, addressed to Miss Gladys Williams, Tattersalls Hotel, West Wallsend, Newcastle, Australia. We used to tease her unmercifully. She had become a nurse, and as a cheeky young 10-year-old, I was always envious of her. I was 14 when the war finished and the men were returning home. Dad and Mum had 5 children, but only 1 son, whom they gave the exact same name as Dad, John Gover Williams. I was born in the middle of the bunch. We stayed in the hotel until 1917, when Dad went back to butchering and set up a new shop in Carrington Street, opposite what is now the Workers' Club. In those days, it was a big two-storied building called Josiah H. Jones Drapery Palace. Old Mr. Jones was a really strict person and was a very important member of the Methodist Church. He and his wife sold good quality clothing, which was all right when people had money, but later on in the 1920s, when some of the mines closed down, he was forced out of business and left the town for good. His beautiful old shop building sat there unused. Eventually, a number of different small businesses used the premises until it was replaced by the Workers' Club in 1951. When I left school about the same time the war ended, I had to help Dad in the shop. I was a bit of a flirt, and some people thought I was quite pretty, but Dad was always around to keep me under control. Sometimes, however, I was allowed to tag along with my older sisters Gladys and Ellen and their friends to some of the social evenings where the men were welcomed home from the war. These were always really big events, generally held in the School of Arts Hall, which was in the main street just down from our shop, and I was in my element, always dressed up to look my prettiest. It was here that I saw Mr. Joseph Millen Taylor, a returned World War I veteran. He was very handsome and still had an English accent which made him sound different from all the local boys. I fell madly in love with him, even though I was only 14 and he was nearly 30. That just made it all the more exciting for me. Joe had come to Australia from Sunderland in England in 1912 when he was about 23 years old. He had stayed with old Bill Turnbull down the bottom end of Carrington Street. They got him a job in the mines until 1914, when the war broke out. He was one of the first to enlist in the 1st Field Artillery Brigade as a driver, service number 2563. He was a survivor of the Gallipoli campaign and fought in Europe before being gas poisoned in 1917, and later wounded again before being returned to Australia in December 1918. Joe never talked about his war experiences, but I learned a lot about his wartime years throughout our married life. Yes, I did win Joe's heart with my persistent attention, and even if I say so myself, we made a good-looking couple. It only took me 5 years to convince him that I was the love of his life too. We married at Hamilton in 1925 when I was 19 and Joe was 36. This was the beginning of a new life for me. This was that life-changing event I mentioned when I started my story. Married life changed everything I knew. Joe continued to work in Abermain Colliery, where he'd gained employment when he returned from the war, so we set up our first home together in Cessnock. What a change that was, away from family and friends, waiting for Joe to finish his shift for the day. After a year or so, Joe was cavilled out, which simply meant that there wasn't enough work and some of the men were sacked. We were unemployed, and so we moved in with Mum and Dad for a couple of months. Dad and Joe never really got on, and so we were eager to find a new life. Joe decided we needed to move to Newcastle, where there might be more opportunities. In fact, after a difficult few weeks, we decided to open our own restaurant in the suburb of Hamilton, where we had been married. Times were hard, and no matter how many hours we worked, we never seemed to break even. So we sold the restaurant and went out to live with Mum and Dad again. This was what we now remember as the beginning of the Great Depression that started in about 1929. Dad was still in the butcher shop, and he said to us one day that he could do with some good, cheap meat, and why didn't we think of that as a job? Well, after Joe and I sat down and talked about it, we decided we would approach Lake Macquarie Council for a lease on some land on Mount Sugarloaf and set up a farm producing beef cattle. Of course, the council response was that they didn't deal with leases. But Joe had really taken to the idea, and so he contacted the Lands Department, and in 1930 they granted us a lease of 5,000 acres on Mount Sugarloaf. He was so excited he grabbed me round the waist, whirled me around until we were both giddy, and said I would be his mountain maid. What a surprise that decision of the land lease was for both of us and the council. They were not impressed, and it was the beginning of a long struggle we had working within the regulations set by council. I have heaps of paper clippings stuck in an old scrapbook about our continued interactions with the council. Joe was not a person who took things easily. He always fought back when he considered he was in the right, and on many occasions, in his struggles with council, he was successful. For the listener, all these interactions can be accessed by Googling Joseph Taylor in the Newcastle Morning Herald between 1925 and 1955. Mount Sugarloaf Summit had a shelter shed built by the council way back before World War I in about 1913, but largely neglected. So when we got the lease, we went straight to the top to look at what we had leased. The view was fantastic, but the task of clearing and stocking areas suitable for cattle seemed almost impossible to me. Joe, however, saw it all as a challenge, and as there was just the two of us, he said we could convert the shelter shed and make it our home to start with. Joe spent hours cursing as he worked, repairing the roof where gun-happy locals had filled it with holes. We worked on trying to make this first little home weatherproof before we moved in. Those first couple of years were a struggle, but gradually we could see some progress. There was a well which had originally been dug by council, but when we arrived was overgrown and dangerous. As we needed fresh water for ourselves and the stock, we set about redigging and cleaning the well. It became a great asset to us after we had fenced it off to keep it safe and clean. With a couple of friends, we made a road from West Wallsend through O'Donnelltown up the face of the mountain so eventually we could transport what we needed. Often we had to use horses laden with food or timber or whatever to climb the mountain. Of course, the blessed bullockies still took timber from the mountain, and our poor road suffered terribly. Joe was not impressed. Some years before, in 1924, the very first car was driven up to our little patch of paradise. It was Mr. Bert Young of Young and Green in his brand new 1924 Maxwell. This made Joe determined to get his own car. It wasn't new, but it was ours, a T model Ford. What memories of the times we had in that little car. As we started to produce cattle suitable for sale to butchers, Joe started looking for other ideas. As I was a reasonably good cook, we decided to build a house with a kiosk and a dance floor so that people could come up the mountain, have some refreshments and relax to take in the view. What a success that idea was. By the early 1930s, we were coming quite settled into our mountain retreat. During these years of the Depression, the government employed men to work on creating a proper road up to the top of the mountain, and this was a work in progress. In fact, a journalist from Newcastle Morning Herald in June 1932 wrote a wonderful article about us and the mountain. I've saved just a little bit of it and I want to read it to you. Recently, control of the reserve, comprising several acres of land at the foot of the summit, was vested in Mr. J. Taylor of West Wallsend, who has made good progress in catering for the comfort and convenience of visitors. He has spent fairly large sums in preparing a road along the mountain ridge to the foot of the peak. So successful has he been in this direction that it is now possible to drive a car to the foot of the large blocks of ironstone forming the mountain peak. On Monday, the beautiful parklands at the foot of the mountain resounded with laughter of about 200 picnickers. After having feasted their eyes on the wonderful panoramic views of the surrounding districts, the holiday makers played games on the well-grassed picnic grounds, which are shaded by a virile growth of gum and oak trees. A cold and crisp morning ensured clarity of atmosphere for the remainder of the day. Descending the steps cut in the rocks, the picnickers opened their lunch baskets and enjoyed an al fresco meal in the parklands. Up to the present, it has been necessary for visitors to carry their food and water, but within a few days' time, picnickers will be able to purchase refreshments at the foot of the mountain at a kiosk built by Mr. Taylor. The article continues to extol the virtues of Mount Sugarloaf. It was written just before we opened our kiosk. After this, the number of visitors increased. It was about this time that we had a funny incident. Well, we both thought it was funny well after the event, but at the time Joe was really angry and I felt remarkably stupid. This is what happened. I was by myself and took the opportunity to sit down by the back door of our lovely new house and have a nice hot cuppa. I looked out over our newly cleaned and restored dam, where there was a large log still lying over the water, and thought how peaceful and quiet it was. Then I saw a huge black snake slithering across the log, heading straight towards me. I automatically reached just inside the back door and grabbed the double-barrel shotgun that we kept there for security. I was panicking, and I shoved a cartridge into the breech, took aim and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. I'd pressed the wrong trigger. I quickly pressed the other trigger, and with a mighty roar the gun went off and knocked me over backwards. I madly scrambled to my feet, but by this time the snake had retreated and was gone. Of course, when Joe came in from work, I told him my story. He went to check up and found the new galvanised water tank we had bought, but not erected as yet, had been in the line of fire, so to speak, and it looked more like a sieve than a tank. Joe decided that the old adage of waste not, want not could apply here. He decided it would make the roof of his new chook house, so he set to and cut it into 2 halves and patched up the holes with some tar that he had in the shed. It may not have been exactly what we planned, but we were adaptable. No water tank, but we did have a nice new chook shed. All of this activity kept me busy, which was important because I worried that we didn't have any children. I really think it may have had something to do with Joe's war injuries. So there was just the 2 of us, and we were happy. We had a life together and a wonderful place to live. I remember the hours of back-breaking toil we put into finding timber and dragging it up the mountain to build that lovely home. It had 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen for me to cook in, and an extra big dining living room with a beautiful hardwood floor. This room doubled as a refreshment room or for parties and dances. It was about 18 metres long and 9 metres wide, or 30 by 60 feet. It was big. We had some grand occasions in this room, from wedding receptions like Lorna Davies in 1934, and in July 1950, the 21st birthday of Elaine Downey, daughter of Dr. Downey. There were over 60 guests, many of them doctors and their wives, for her birthday, and it was a wonderful occasion. We even catered for conferences. You see, one of the men that Joe knew quite well was the Mayor of Newcastle, Alderman Quinlan, who became the first Lord Mayor of Newcastle in 1948. He loved nothing better than to bring his friends and business associates to our restaurant, where we treated them as honoured guests and provided my lovely fresh cooking. It was such a unique occasion for so many of the guests, as they had never experienced the view from our eyrie on the mountain, and they all seemed to enjoy the fare we offered too. Word spread, and for many of those years during the 1930s and early 1940s, Joe and I worked hard and reflected on how fortunate we were. In 1936, Joe negotiated with council to allow free access to the pinnacle, so long as the council provided conveniences, shelter sheds, and labour to improve the road access. If the council agreed to these conditions, Joe would maintain the facilities. But the path to negotiation with the council was never easy for poor Joe, and he had to seek legal advice on a number of occasions. Sadly, one occasion unrelated to the council was when my own dad accused him of assault. It was all over a stupid can of oil, and because Dad had probably had too much to drink. They ended up in a fisticuff, rolling around on the ground in the backyard at Carrington Street until a neighbour came and separated them. Poor Joe had to counter-sue Dad, and things were pretty unpleasant for a while. In the end, the judge just dismissed both cases. One of Joe's hobbies was astronomy, and he constantly remarked on how clear and clean the air was on Mount Sugarloaf. He decided he would build an astronomy shed on the top of the pinnacle. He worked like a beaver to get the timber to the very top of the mountain and construct his special shed. Once the shed was built, he then invested in a beautiful telescope and set it up in his light-darkened shed. It was fascinating, and we would spend hours stargazing at night, with Joe telling me about the various constellations and the way the universe worked. Of course, the council took exception to this building on the pinnacle, which they insisted should be available for all to access. Joe didn't stop visitors, but if they wanted to view the world through his telescope, they had to pay 6p a person. Only the council objected to us charging money, but if we didn't in those early days, our income was limited. As the years passed and we were getting older, we found the weather, especially the long dry spells and the constant threat of bushfires, and the terrain made raising cattle in this mountainous country so difficult that Joe went back to work in Stockrington Mine, or maybe it was Freeman's Tunnel Mine. I'm not sure now. This meant he had to ride his horse down through the bush to the mine site, which was a couple of miles away. We tried to keep the kiosk going and the cattle, but it was a struggle, and on some occasions poor Joe would get quite exhausted and a little bit aggravated. By the late 1930s, the road to the top of Mount Sugarloaf had been built by many of the men who were unemployed because of the long depression. It wasn't sealed, that came much later, but it was an easier and safer way to reach our place. Generally speaking, most people were really impressed with what they found when they visited our scenic Mount Sugarloaf. Articles were written in the paper and visitor numbers continued to increase, and there were even day bus tours. However, sometimes people would come up and walk all over the property and not show due care. Once a schoolteacher brought a large group of teenage schoolchildren up to climb to the pinnacle. Unfortunately, Joe was not feeling very well and ordered them off the property. He said the kids were climbing the fences and not shutting the gates. The schoolteacher was sure that they had been behaving themselves, so she took him to court. It was a tiresome time, and we were both glad when the court case was over even though Joe had to make a payment including court costs. One day, about this time, when Joe was very tired and he was riding home after his shift in the mine, his horse shied at something, perhaps a calf or a wallaby, and raced off through the bush. A tree branch hit him and knocked him to the ground, causing him to break his shoulder quite badly. Joe said to me later that when he came to, he didn't know what to do, as he was dazed and in so much pain. But probably his wartime experiences taught him that he had to help himself, because nobody would know where he was. He managed to catch his horse, drag himself back into the saddle, and struggle into the ambulance station in West Wallsend. One of the ambulance men later said he didn't know how Joe had managed, as his injuries were so severe and he must have been in so much pain. He had to take many weeks to convalesce. Joe was now in his late 50s, and so we decided it was time to leave our beloved mountain and move back to the plain. We had also heard a whisper that the government planned to reclaim some of the land for a telecommunications tower, whatever that might be. The thought frightened us and helped us make our decision. In 1950, we bought a lovely block of land in Croft Road, Elibarna, facing our beloved Mount Sugarloaf, and in 1951 we moved off the mountain into the home we lived in for the rest of our lives. Even our move off the mountain, however, was fraught with conflict with the council. At one of their meetings in September 1949, they discussed the possibility that Mount Sugarloaf should become a public reserve and the council should take over the lease. In other words, get rid of the Taylors. Other councillors objected, saying even if it was a tourist destination, council didn't have the money to maintain it. It was recommended that legal advice be sought. So the arguments continued until Joe and I quietly decided not to renew our lease at the end of 1950. Even that caused controversy, and in late 1950, one councillor demanded that the kiosk and buildings be demolished. A friend of ours, and also a councillor, took great satisfaction in announcing to those present at the meeting that the kiosk and buildings had already been dismantled and moved to Elibarna, where they were being used in the erection of the new home for the Taylors. We weren't sorry to have made the move, as there was already more talk about building TV towers on the mountain. We couldn't imagine our wonderful mountain being the home to ugly metal towers creating great gashes in the skyline. Well, that did happen, and in our lifetime too, but thankfully sometime after we had left. The first tower built for NBN began in November 1961, and the ABC followed soon after. Both towers were in operation by June 1963. Our beautiful mountain home, where we spent 20 years of our lives, would never be the same again. All his life, Joe suffered, from his war injuries and from working in the mines, not to mention the strenuous life of making a living on Mount Sugarloaf. In retirement, it continued to take a toll on his health, and he died aged 78 in 1968, a respected veteran of World War I and a much-loved husband. As I was a lot younger than Joe and had kept reasonably good health, this meant that I spent many years in our lovely home by myself, until I met a friend to share our time together. We managed to keep busy with many projects in and around the house and town until our passing. My death occurred in 1993 when I was 87 years old. I think I had a life well lived and owe so much of it to a man named Joe.
Violet Taylor's story is one of resilience, hard work, and a lifelong partnership that helped shape the history of Mount Sugarloaf. From her West Wallsend childhood to 2 decades on the mountain, Vi lived a life filled with challenges, achievements, and remarkable memories. We hope you're enjoying this series, Westy Women, and look forward to you joining us for more stories of some of the pioneering women of West Wallsend on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.